Okay. So I will be talking about slavery and social power in early New York's Dutch Reformed churches. Um, I'm looking at these churches as social spaces, cultural spaces, but especially for this particular research as a social space. So I'm not really focusing on the religious aspect so much, but more so on what these spaces meant as important places of social interaction in these communities. And I'm especially looking at early New York. That's where I did all my research. But a lot of this pertains to Dutch Reformed churches in New Jersey and other parts of North America as well. So, but my research really focused on this particular area. I want to just note before I get started that I have a lot of the materials that I use, the images that I use. I was able to get those thanks to the various administrators at the Dutch Reformed churches that I visited, clergy who talked with me, walked me through their churches, church historians who sat down with me and checked records with me. So I just want to thank them for really making this possible, for me having been able to do this research that I'm going to share with you now. And this is a part of the book that's coming out in October. It's one of the different spaces that I look at as one of the spaces of enslavement, if you will. Okay, so I have a little roadmap so that you know what's coming during this talk. So I'll be looking at three different parts of these churches. I'm looking at the congregations, the church buildings, and the church yard, if you will, the outer space that's still part of these churches. And when looking at the congregation, some of the questions that I'll be talking about is who could become full members within these churches, who could hold positions of power in these churches. When looking at the church buildings, I'll be going through some of the architecture, how this changed over time, and what this says about the social dynamics within the church and within the community and how they're reflected. Spatial segregation within these churches. And then when looking at the churchyard, I'll be looking at the churchyard as a social space, and also a little bit, I'll talk briefly about the cemetery. And what I'll conclude is that these congregations practices of selective admission to these churches, to the buildings, to the churchyards, but also segregation within these spaces, reinforce the social and racial hierarchies that supported slavery in their communities. Okay, so I'm going to get started, and I'll talk about James Murphy first. And James Murphy, I don't know if many of you or some of you are familiar with him. He was a minister at the, and I might mispronounce some of these names. I know I sometimes do, the Warwarsing and Rochester and Clove churches in what is Ulster County, New York. He accepted a call to those churches in 1814, but when he did so, he kept a powerful secret. Although he appeared to be a white man, his mother, Jane Cox, was in fact a Black woman who, at the time of his birth, was held in bondage. As a child of an enslaved woman, Murphy had been enslaved upon birth, but in accordance with Johnson's will, the man who enslaved him and his mother, he actually received this freedom in 1809. He was 21 years at the time, and within 5 years of actually becoming free, he was able to complete his degree at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. He became an ordained minister in the Dutch Reformed Church and accepted the call at the churches in Ulster County in 1814. When he did so, he hid his background from the congregation, at one point even claiming that his mother had died when in fact she was still very much alive. Now, he likely did so because he understood that as a freed Black man, he would not be accepted in such a highly respected church position. At the time, in the early 19th century, Dutch Reformed churches had increased significantly. The number of Black congregants in these churches had increased significantly after a century-long period where we see really very few Black people in these churches. But even though we see that the numbers of Black people in Dutch Reformed churches increased in the early 19th century, They still were generally seated in a separate section of the church. They often had to wait to receive communion until white congregants had done so. And Black elders and deacons were non existent in the predominantly white Dutch Reformed churches. So, Black congregants were generally not accepted in positions of power, and certainly not as a minister, as James Murphy, who literally or quite physically looked down on his congregation as he was preaching from his elevated pulpit. So he understood that he could not share his background with his congregation within the context of his society at the time. And indeed, when congregants discovered that Murphy was a formerly enslaved Black man, it caused great turmoil in his community. At this point, he had served at these congregations for almost 10 years. Most of the congregants were willing to accept him regardless of his personal background once they discovered, but possibly they did so because they did not want to draw too much attention to the fact that a Black man was their minister. There were a few people within the congregation who did not let go. They were Anne Bouvier, Dirk Westbrook, and Rachel Westbrook, and they argued that Murphy should be discharged from their congregation. They insinuated that he had lied about his background to hide, and I'm quoting now one of them, the imputation of African mixture in his pedigree. They also claimed that the Rochester congregation initially was willing to forget about this, but then when they found out that his mother was still alive, even though he said that she had died, they felt that he had lied to them once again, and this is what they could not let go of. Now, James Murphy, in the long run, was able to continue his position at these churches. And he, at some point, even served as the president of the Synod, the first Black person to do so, although he was not, I don't think he was actually like known as such or presented him as such even then. He eventually did leave these churches, and I believe that Susan Stason-Cohn is writing a biography on him. And one of the things that she found is that even though he's able to maintain a position as a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church for a while, eventually he does, his background kind of catches up with him and he ends up in poverty. Now, why is he important? I think he's important for a couple of reasons for what I will be talking about. And one of it is that he is an example of somebody who understood that for Black people within the Dutch Reformed Church, even if they could become members, even at this point, it was quite impossible to achieve certain positions of power as he would. It also is important to think about the spatial elements of that. Like I mentioned, he was quite literally in this pulpit looking down on his congregation. And that's a very symbolic position to be in. Now, let me move on to just briefly look at, well, what did membership in the Dutch Reformed Church look like, and what does that tell us about social power in these churches and the social makeup of these churches and how they reflect the community. And I think that is the important part to keep in mind here, is that being a part of these churches also meant that you held a certain position within the community at large, and only people who had a certain position within these community could in fact become, for example, church elders. Now, here are some of the records from the Kingston Church, and these are located at the Ulster County Archives. One of them on the left, you see that this is a woman who, Rachel, who, when she was doing her profession of faith and was accepted as a full member within the Kingston Church in 1703, had to actually promise that, and I'm quoting now, that she shall serve her mistress, Catherine Cotijn, loyally and humbly until Catherine's death. And after that, she would serve young Cotijn for 8 more months. Now, this is, I think, especially important, thinking about it in the context of the fact that a lot of people at the time worried that if they would if the people they enslaved would become Christian, then they might use that to actually argue for their freedom. And this came out of, a lot of the writings within the Dutch Reformed Church that actually said that a Christian could not enslave a Christian. And so this actually, soon after this particular case, the New York colony actually puts in his legislation that enslaved people could not argue for their freedom because they're Christians. But we see here that this was a real concern with people in 1703. And so this was one of the problems that existed within these communities, right? Like if you accept somebody within your church, if you accept somebody especially as a full member of your church, what does that mean in how for their position within the community more broadly? Does that mean that you can still enslave them in this particular instance? But also maybe does that mean that they could then challenge more broadly their position within their community? When you accept them as an equal before God, then can you really still enslave them or limit their possibilities, their opportunities within society based on the color of their skin? You can see on the right here too, from 1750, Elizabeth, who was an enslaved woman who became a member in that same church. So we do see that some enslaved people became members in the church in the 18th century, but it's very unusual. And you can see her right here, Elizabeth, she's right here. Now, let me show you this letter by Reverend Peter Lowe. So Peter Lowe was a minister in the 6 congregations of Kings County. And he became a minister there in the 1780s. And soon after, a group of Black men asked to become full members in his church. And in response to that, or in the aftermath of that, he wrote a letter to an unnamed friend, and he detailed some of the objections that his congregants had for accepting these people into his church. And you can see 2 of those objections here. And the first of, I'm going to read them to you. You can read with me. So objection 4 is the first one that I have here. They are a species very different from us. Witness their nauseous sweat, complexion, manners, etc. I cannot endure them near me. I would be ashamed to commune with them. And then the other objection, number 8 in his list of 10, said, and I quote, "If many Negroes be admitted, I tremble for the ark. Adieu, order and harmony in the Dutch church. See the absurd consequences. Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight. Negro elders, deacons, church masters, etc." And so this comes to the other part of it, right? Like on the one hand, there's very concretely the threat that enslaved people, if they become members, they might challenge their enslavement. But there's also the idea that they might actually consider themselves equal to white people, the same people who might in fact enslave them. I mean, at the time in Kings County, the majority of the Black people in Kings County by far were in fact enslaved. So it's very likely that these men were in fact enslaved people at the time. In some of these townships, some of these areas of Kings County, about 75% of the households enslaved people in their home. So the majority of the people in Kings County was benefiting from the labor of enslaved people. And so they really worried, as you can see in these objections, that allowing enslaved people or allowing Black people could significantly challenge that social hierarchy that was so important for them in sustaining their system. Now, one of the other objections revolved around communion, and it's objection 9. And they mentioned the Lord's table and communion in one of the other ones as well, right? But here they actually say in objection 9, they will intermix with white people at the Lord's table to their great offense. And this is important in that, so according to John Calvin, actually everybody was supposed to have have communion together. That was something that at that particular moment everybody should share that and be equal. And but we see here that to these white congregants, that was a significant fear they had, that they would actually have to share that with the people they held in bondage, that they would have to sit at the same table and share the sacrament of communion. And so Reverend Lowe actually responds to them by saying, and I quote, "Are they Pharisees to choose the principal seats? Will not Christian prudence and humility dictate to them a place at the table by themselves?" And this is actually something that became quite common in Dutch churches, and other churches as well. That we see that enslaved people and free Black people, when they were accepted in churches, in these churches, and if they had the right to communion, if they obtained that right to communion, then oftentimes they were separated. They would either sit at a separate table, or they would have to wait until all others, all white congregants, received communion for them to be able to access that. And this is discussed by Frederick Douglass. And I have his quote in here because there's I have not seen any descriptions from Black people in New York on how they actually experience this. But Frederick Douglass does. He does describe this in his book, My Bondage and My Freedom. And he writes about this experience in New England, in a church there. And I want to just briefly read this to you to see how he experienced that separation and that segregation um, in partaking in communion in this church. So he wrote, "There were only about a half dozen colored members attached to the Elm Street Church at this time. After the congregation was dismissed, these descended from the gallery and took a seat against the wall, most distant from the altar. Brother Bonnie was very animated and sung very sweetly, 'Salvation, 'tis a joyful sound,' and soon began to administer the sacrament. I was anxious to observe the bearing of colored members, and the result was most humiliating. The white members went forward to the altar by the bench full, and when it was evident that all whites had been served with the bread and wine, Brother Bonnie beckoned with his hand, exclaiming, 'Come forward, colored friends, come forward. You too have an interest in the blood of Christ.'" And what I think is so telling here is the word humiliating, right? How he experienced this was very humiliating, that they had to wait until all white people in this church had received communion to be able to do so. And again, this is a practice that we see throughout these communities where even when Black people do obtain the right to communion, they're still separated. And one of the other things to just note is that communion was one way to also control people's behavior within the community at large. We see that when people are behaving in a way that's considered improper, that that right to communion could be taken away from them. There's one example in Kingston, for example, where a woman who supposedly falsely accuses a man of fathering her child is taken away the right to communion for having lied, according to the congregation. And so this is something, it was a very powerful tool within these communities that of course has it has a religious significance, but it also has an important social significance. Now I'm going to move on to the church buildings and look a little bit at the architecture and the seating arrangements and the spatial and temporal segregation within these churches. So this is an image of a 17th century Dutch church during service. You can see that, of course, in the Netherlands at the time, a lot of the churches had been Catholic churches. They were all Dutch churches, but they had been Catholic churches and were turned into Dutch Reformed churches. This is an example of that. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that it looks a little bit chaotic. There's dogs running around. This apparently was very common in early modern European churches. It also is common in Dutch Reformed churches to actually have many different things going on, even during a service. And this in part is it comes out of the idea that there, according to John Calvin, churches were not sacred spaces. It's about the word of God, and you can worship anywhere. And so, what we oftentimes see in these Calvinist denominations is that a lot of different things were happening in churches, in the same way that you see in Puritan, the Puritan meeting houses in New England that were also political spaces. People were also meeting there for political meetings, not just for religious worship. Like they had many different functions. Now you can also see in this image that there are people sitting on the ground. At the time, people were usually standing. There was not seating for everybody, so a lot of people would be standing or bringing their own seats into the church. And this is actually something that you also see in 17th century New York churches, and there's some sources that show that people indeed had a seat that they would take into the church to sit on. Here are some examples of Calvinist churches, Huguenot examples. And I have these because they're such great paintings of actually what these churches would have looked like. And this is then in Huguenot examples in France. And one of the things that you can see is that these churches, they have the galleries, they have this elevated pulpit that was really elevated quite high. You can also see that there's like the octagonal churches. That was a very common architectural style for Dutch Reformed churches. And if not that, they were oftentimes square. So the idea was that like the layout was square, and the idea was that everybody that way would be the closest to the minister, so they could best hear the word of God, which of course was the central part of religious worship in these churches. Now, usually in these churches, they were segregated by gender. And this is something that we also see in early New York. The men would be commonly seated in the galleries and on benches on the side. So if you look at these, they would have been the ones sitting here or here and in these galleries. And women and children would be sitting here in the center. And the reason being that the men were considered within the society more important, and they were the ones who were more important also in listening to the word of God. So they were the ones who were closest to the minister. They were the closest in the gallery, closest to the minister. It was believed that there you could best hear the sermon. They also were the ones who would watch and check the sermon, especially, of course, church elders who always were facing the minister. Even you see that even today in the churches. But also they could be actually from those positions, from those places, keep an eye on congregants. And so this is another important element of kind of the layout of these churches and the seating arrangements in these churches. And so when we look at New York, we see, for example, in the First Church of Albany, this was the second building, which was erected in 1715. We see that square architectural church with a turreted roof and the bell in the center there. You see in the interior here the elevated pulpit, and this is the pulpit that they actually had in this church. They were able to save that, and that is today still in the what I believe is the third building, but what is today the First Church in Albany. And you can see the galleries here. You can see the galleries here. And then these would be the seats for the consistory, and these are predominantly the women and the children who would be seated there. Older men who would not be able to access the gallery would be sitting on the sides here. So they would be on the first floor, but they would be sitting on the sides. And here is just one example of the records in which you can actually see that the men were seated in the gallery and how they were separated. And so this gender separation was important in also how the different roles that men and women had within these communities, and the roles that they played within the church. And so you can see on this particular record, I've circled it in red where it actually says it in Dutch. But in English translated is that the spaces for the men in the gallery will not be larger as they have been previously. So that's a record from the Kingston Church in 1754. Now, by the latter part of the 18th century, we see that the architecture of these churches changes. And one example where you can see that is the Fishkill Church, which was erected in 1731. At the time, it was very similar to what you saw with the Albany Church. So this square church building. And if you look here, and you can see when I move the mouse, right? Can somebody nod? Yeah. Okay. Good. So um, this would have been the entrance. The pulpit would have been here across from the entrance. And of course, here the bell would have been here in the center. And then they moved this to actually have the entrance here on this side with a bell tower. So they would add a bell tower on that side, and then the pulpit would be lowered somewhat and would go to this side. And this is what we see in a lot of the churches today, right? That same organization has remained. And when you look in these churches, this is the Fishkill interior on the inside. You can actually see that church door still there of the old entrance. So this is something that happened at Fishkill. It happened at the Shawangang Church. Let me see. I'm saying that wrong too. Sorry. I think it's Shangang. I don't know. I was in a conversation once with people who lived in the area, and they couldn't even agree on this. So I was even more confused after that conversation. I'm going to say Shangang. But so this church too had initially was this square and had the entrance on the south side of the building. And today you can see it here on the side where the entrance used to be. Now, this was a really like early Republic change in architecture. And it actually, at this point, then these churches very much resemble we see a same shift in New England with Puritan churches. The meeting house becomes more of a church type of architecture. But actually, when you look at Anglican churches in the South, you see a similar architecture during this period. So these changes are not particular, like these new forms of churches are really, I think, kind of a new American style of architecture that you see influencing churches across the region in this, in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Now, with that, we also see that the organization, the seating arrangements within the church change. So the pulpit, of course, the location of the pulpit changes. It's oftentimes lowered. And the galleries are lowered a little bit as well. Now, with this lowering of the pulpit, the galleries are no longer considered the primary, the prime seating in the house. And so this is where you see that now oftentimes the organization in the church is really not by gender anymore. It's rather by pews. And of course, those are paid for by people. And so it kind of depends on how much money you have and how much money you can invest in this and which pew you can purchase. And the closer you are to the pulpit, the more expensive these would be. This is a plan for the pews at the New Paltz Church, which is at the historic Huguenot Street. So this was erected in 1839. So of course, this is about a decade after slavery was abolished in the region. We do see that they had a separate section, however, for Black congregants, and I will show you that. in a second. So here is the plan for the second floor. So what I just showed you is the first floor, and here's the plan for the second floor. And if you look closely, you can see here that this was the seat for, and I quote, the colored males, and this was the area, I quote, for the colored females. And here is the document that actually details that those particular pews were designated for Black people, Black congregants. So when we think about, oftentimes what is said is that Black people, enslaved people, were seated in on the balcony or in the galleries, right? That starts to happen in the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th century, but not before that, because as I noted, before that, those would have been the primary seats in the house. It's kind of like a theater where the gallery is like the VIP spot to be. So it's not until the 19th century that we see that changes, and that enslaved and free Black people are mostly located in that area. But as you see on this one, in most cases that I have seen, they are located all the way in the back. So they're not really on the sides, they're all the way on the back, that close by the doors. That's where they are seated. And we see then at this point that they really have these designated seats for enslaved and free Black people. Whereas in the 18th century, that was not really the case. In most cases, I believe that they would have been what I see as in between spaces. Like they would have been sometimes sitting with the people who enslaved them. Sometimes they would have been waiting in the back, or maybe even outside. It's not until the latter part of the 18th century, and especially in the early 19th century, where we see more people attending these churches, that there's these designated seats and designated areas where they're that are for the Black congregants. And this is a picture of the seat of the male section in the New Paltz Church, and you can see here a picture of what the view would have been. And this comes back to also what these seats meant for the people who were in them, right? Like not only were they restricted to these particular seats, these were always the seats that were the farthest away from the pulpit. They would have been really, it would have been very hard to hear what actually was going on, what the minister was actually preaching. And that's important to keep in mind as well. Now, one of the things we see actually is that the people in the church use their spending power, if you will, to also negotiate in some cases where they would be seated, but also where the Black congregants would be seated. And this in particular happens that I know of, that I've seen in the Albany church, where in fact one of the white congregants refused to pay the money for his pew until the Black people behind him were actually removed. And in the Albany church, and this happened in some other churches as well, older Black people would sometimes be allowed to sit on the first floor all the way in the back, and the younger people would be sitting on the second floor all the way in the back. And so they then in the Albany church actually directed eventually to have those people removed from where he wanted them removed, and have them sit on the second floor. So we see that there was some real negotiations going on there too. Now, there is some talk that enslaved and free Black people also would have had in these churches separate entrances, so that they wouldn't even have to so that white congregants wouldn't even have to interact with Black people or use the same entrances. And some of the examples that some historians have used is the Shangang Church, where you can see here that there's actually a stairwell that actually goes to the gallery that is separate from the main entrance of the church. The church historian vehemently denies that this was actually the case, and I have not seen the records, so I don't know if this is the case. It's possible. And I have heard from some other people some anecdotes, and I think there's a church in New Jersey actually that I've heard of that had a separate entrance for Black congregants, but I personally have not been able to actually visit that church and see that. Now, again, I haven't seen any evidence of Black congregants in New York describing their experiences in these churches. But there are some examples from New England churches that I just want to briefly share with you. One of them is from a memoir of William Brown, who wrote about really, being in churches in very similar circumstances as we know that these Black congregants would have been in Dutch Reformed churches. He writes, many attended no church at all because they said they were opposed to going to churches and sitting in pigeonholes as all the churches at that time at some obscure place for the colored to sit in. So as he's noting, like for a lot of Black congregants, they'd rather not go to church at all than to actually sit in these designated segregated spaces within these churches. Cato Pierce wrote about this as well when he wrote, and the gentleman I worked for went and showed me the box for the colored people. I pretty soon found out it was a Presbyterian church. I was so far off the minister, and he preached by notes that I couldn't understand hardly anything he said. And this comes back to what I mentioned earlier, right? That the spaces where they were located, oftentimes it was so far removed from a minister that would be very hard to kind of hear everything that was going on. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly is the churchyard. The churchyard also was an important social space, and it also was a reflection of society and the social hierarchies within society that were so important to also sustain a system of slavery, of race-based slavery. The church was an important social space, and the cemeteries were a part of this. So I briefly am going to just mention a few things about this. First of all, you can see, as you can see here in this depiction of this painting by Edward Lamson Henry, titled Sunday Morning, Old Church at Brunswick. This painting actually depicts the Shangang Church in Ulster County, the one that I showed you previously. You can see there the stairs to the galleries. This church, or this painting, is a good reflection of some of the descriptions you'll also see of people gathering on Sunday, wearing their best clothing, and a lot of it was pageantry, people showing their position within the community. There's a description of a man who would come with his wagon, and enslaved men. I mean, all these wagons would have been, many of the drivers would have been Black men, would have come there, and during service, these Black people would have been taking care of the horses and such. But it really, it's described as, showing off his position, his power, his wealth, by actually bringing these people to the church, and how a lot of it was, connecting with family, connecting with friends, but also showing your position within the community and kind of reinforcing that. And that is in part depicted here, right, with the beautiful dresses. Now, and the wagons, and everybody is talking and catching up on news. The church, for a lot of these communities, was a very important space where you could actually do that, where you could meet your friends, family, neighbors. The churchyard was also an important space to actually get the newest news, the news. And in fact, at the church door, oftentimes announcements would have been posted about things that were happening. And in fact, at Southern churches, they would oftentimes also post notices of enslaved people had run away. I have not seen this at Dutch Reformed churches, but it's possible that they in fact did the same thing there. It was not uncommon in other places. So this was an important social space, and enslaved people and partook in that in some ways. They were there, but oftentimes to serve the people that enslaved them. There are some accounts of enslaved people who would come in from the community and actually bring goods to sell if there was a picnic in the churchyard. So it was an important social space. And you see the continuation of the social hierarchies within the community also in that display at these churchyards. Now, looking at the cemeteries, it's similar in some ways that one of the things we've seen that so first of all, importantly, um, there technically should be no funeral services in Dutch Reformed churches. Like that's not one of the sacraments. That's not something that, and we actually see Dutch Reformed churches communicate about this, that's not something that they're supposed to do. But people were oftentimes buried in the church cemetery, and you paid for that. And oftentimes the spaces closest to the church were the ones that were most expensive. And so once again, we see that people who have more spending power were able to obtain these more prominent spaces even after death, even within this cemetery. Now, for enslaved and free Black people, it was very unlikely that they would be buried in the cemetery at the churchyard. That very rarely happened. There are some cases where it did happen, but it's very rare. In most cases, they would have been buried somewhere else, in oftentimes on land that wasn't really considered of any importance. They oftentimes wouldn't have any tombstones or anything like that. And so it was one of those spaces where we very clearly see the segregation, or in this case, the exclusion largely of Black people. And that's a very significant showing also of who belongs and who does not belong. Now, we also see that for some people, they would even would be buried within the church. And there's some plaques here that I have included of people who were buried in the church or right by the church. Here's on the left, you see the Fishkill Church. Abraham Brinkerhoff was one of the early deacons in the church, as the plaque says. And on the right, you see Domini Johannes Mauritius Groetius and Domini Henry Polhelmus, who both were buried, who'd been ministers at the Shangang Church, and who both have been buried there. So those people who really had like a high position within this church, a position of power, if you will, they would be able to even get their burial grounds or their final resting place within the church. So coming back to the conclusion then, what we see in these burial practices, in the way that these churches are organized, in the way that the congregations are dealing with whether or not they want to admit Black people, free or enslaved, we see that there's a practice of selective admission to those spaces, the church, the churchyard, the cemetery, an exclusion from those buildings and churchyards, and segregation within those spaces reinforced the social and racial hierarchies that supported slavery in their community. So to be able to support slavery, these were some of the things that were necessary to really be able to sustain that system of race-based slavery within their communities. And so it's a reflection of what was going on in the community, but it also was a way to sustain it, because they understood that if they would accept Black people within their churches as equals, then that would also be a pathway to challenging their position within the community at large. And that is it. I will leave it there. If you have any questions or suggestions, I would love to hear them now. So please, share your questions via the chat, but also feel free to email me if you have questions that or thoughts that you'd like to share afterwards. And you can find me on Twitter. Sometimes I tweet, not often, but sometimes I do. So yes, please, I will stop sharing, Deborah, if that's okay.
Yep,
The screen,
yep.
and we can go to questions if there's any.
That was great. That was so interesting.